In the earliest days of human civilization, when the Great Pyramids were rising from the desert sands and the cities of Mesopotamia flourished between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, people were already trying to understand the mysteries of the human mind. Ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian texts describe mental disturbances, though the explanations they offered were very different from what we might propose today. These ancient peoples often attributed unusual behaviors, troubled thoughts, and emotional suffering to supernatural forces rather than natural causes. They believed that spirits, demons, or the displeasure of gods could enter a person and disturb their mental equilibrium. Priests and healers performed rituals, incantations, and ceremonies to drive out these malevolent forces, and while their understanding was rooted in the spiritual worldview of their time, they were nonetheless attempting to address very real human suffering. These early attempts to comprehend and treat mental disturbances represent humanity's first steps toward what would eventually become the field of psychology, even though the methods and explanations were so vastly different from modern approaches. Meanwhile, in ancient India, a rich tradition of philosophical and spiritual inquiry was developing that would have profound implications for understanding the mind. Ancient Indian texts like the Upanishads and Buddhist writings analyzed consciousness, attention, and suffering with remarkable sophistication and depth. These texts explored questions about the nature of the self, the sources of human unhappiness, and the possibility of transforming one's mental state through disciplined practice. The Buddhist tradition in particular developed detailed maps of consciousness, cataloging different mental states and the conditions that give rise to them. These ancient explorations would influence later contemplative and mindfulness-based psychological approaches, though it would take many centuries before Western psychology began to seriously engage with these Eastern traditions. The practices of meditation, mindful awareness, and systematic introspection developed in ancient India represent a parallel stream of psychological investigation that proceeded quite independently from Western developments for thousands of years. In ancient China, another distinct approach to understanding human nature and mental well-being was taking shape. Confucian and Taoist writings discussed emotions, self-control, and harmonious living, offering guidance on how to cultivate virtue, maintain balance, and live in accordance with natural principles. Confucian thought emphasized social harmony, proper relationships, and the cultivation of moral character through education and self-discipline. Taoist philosophy, by contrast, emphasized flowing with nature, accepting change, and avoiding excessive striving that might disturb one's inner peace. Both traditions offered practical wisdom about managing emotions, responding to life's challenges, and maintaining mental equilibrium. These ideas would influence later Eastern approaches to mental health, creating therapeutic traditions that emphasized balance, acceptance, and harmony rather than the more analytical and interventionist approaches that would characterize much of Western psychology. The ancient Greeks made contributions that would more directly shape the Western psychological tradition. Ideas about the mind and behavior appear in ancient Greek philosophy, especially in the works of Plato and Aristotle, who debated how knowledge is acquired and the role of reason versus experience. Plato believed that knowledge was essentially a matter of remembering eternal truths that the soul had encountered before birth, suggesting that learning was really a process of recollection rather than the acquisition of something entirely new. He saw the material world as an imperfect reflection of perfect forms or ideals that existed in a realm beyond the senses. Aristotle, Plato's student, took a very different view, arguing that knowledge comes from careful observation of the world around us and that we learn by experiencing things through our senses and then abstracting general principles from particular instances. This debate between rationalism and empiricism, between the primacy of reason and the primacy of experience, would echo through the centuries and remain central to psychological theory even into the modern era. Hippocrates, the famous Greek physician often called the father of medicine, made a revolutionary proposal about mental disorders. In ancient Greece, Hippocrates proposed that mental disorders could be linked to imbalances of bodily humors rather than possession by spirits. According to his theory, the body contained 4 fundamental fluids or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health resulted from these humors being in proper balance, while illness, including mental illness, resulted from imbalances. While this theory was incorrect in its particulars, it represented a crucial shift in thinking because it naturalized mental disturbance, removing it from the realm of supernatural explanation and placing it in the domain of physical medicine. This meant that mental disorders could potentially be treated through diet, exercise, bloodletting, and other medical interventions rather than through exorcism or spiritual rituals. It was a move toward understanding the mind as connected to the body and subject to natural laws. Building on Hippocratic ideas, the Greek physician Galen linked temperament to bodily humors, influencing personality thinking for centuries. Galen elaborated a theory in which an excess of blood made one sanguine, cheerful, and optimistic. An excess of yellow bile made one choleric, quick to anger. An excess of black bile made one melancholic, prone to sadness, and an excess of phlegm made one phlegmatic, calm, and unemotional. This theory of the 4 temperaments proved remarkably durable, persisting well into the Renaissance and beyond. While we now understand personality in very different terms, Galen's framework represented an early attempt to create a systematic typology of individual differences in emotion and behavior, and it kept alive the idea that mental characteristics had physical causes rooted in the body's constitution. Another Greek philosopher, Democritus, offered an even more radically materialist view. The Greek philosopher Democritus speculated that mental activities arise from the movement of tiny atoms in the body and brain, an early materialist view of mind. Democritus believed that everything in the universe, including thoughts and feelings, could ultimately be explained by the arrangements and movements of tiny, indivisible particles he called atoms. This was an extraordinarily prescient idea, anticipating by more than 2,000 years the modern understanding that mental processes are indeed rooted in the physical activity of the brain. Though Democritus had no way to observe neurons or measure brain activity, his insistence that mind could be understood in purely physical terms represented an important philosophical position that would be revived many times throughout history. As the ancient world gave way to the medieval period, psychological thinking continued in various forms. Medieval scholars in the Islamic Golden Age, such as Avicenna, wrote about mental illness and treatments, anticipating later clinical ideas in psychology. While Europe entered what is sometimes called the Dark Ages, the Islamic world experienced a flourishing of learning and scholarship. Avicenna, known in Arabic as Ibn Sina, was a Persian polymath who wrote extensively about medicine and philosophy. His canon of medicine included detailed descriptions of various mental disorders and suggested treatments that were remarkably humane and sophisticated for their time. He discussed conditions that we might now call anxiety, depression, and psychosis, and he recognized that mental and physical health were intimately connected. The work of Avicenna and other Islamic scholars preserved and extended Greek and Roman medical knowledge during a period when much of it was lost in Europe. In medieval Europe itself, the treatment of mental disturbance took a darker turn. Medieval European asylums, such as Bethlehem, often called Bedlam, confined people with mental disturbances under harsh conditions, predating modern treatment models. These institutions were more like prisons than hospitals, and people with mental disorders were often chained, poorly fed, and subjected to abuse. The famous Bethlehem Hospital in London became so notorious for the chaotic conditions and the suffering of its inmates that the word Bedlam entered the English language as a term for uproar and confusion. People would even pay to visit the asylum as a form of entertainment, gawking at the unfortunate residents as though they were animals in a zoo. These appalling conditions would eventually provoke reform movements, but for centuries, this was the reality for many people experiencing severe mental disturbance. Medieval scholastic philosophers, working within the Christian tradition, also grappled with questions about mind and soul. Medieval scholastics such as Thomas Aquinas integrated Aristotelian ideas about the soul, perception, and intellect into Christian theology. Aquinas attempted to reconcile Aristotle's philosophy with Christian doctrine, arguing that reason and faith were compatible and that the careful study of nature could lead to knowledge of God. He discussed how the soul animates the body, how perception works, and how human intellect differs from that of angels or animals. His synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology became extremely influential in European universities and helped establish a framework for thinking about mind that combined philosophical analysis with religious doctrine. As Europe moved from the medieval period into the Renaissance and early modern era, new intellectual currents began to emerge. The term psychology came into broader academic use in the 16th and 17th centuries. Derived from the Greek words psyche, meaning soul or mind, and logos, meaning study or discourse, the word psychology began appearing in academic texts as scholars increasingly sought to study the mind systematically. This represented a growing recognition that the study of mental life deserved its own specialized field of inquiry, distinct from theology, philosophy, or medicine, though still overlapping with all of them. One of the most influential figures in this period was René Descartes, the French philosopher and mathematician. René Descartes proposed mind-body dualism, shaping later debates in psychology. Descartes argued that reality consists of two fundamentally different kinds of substance: mental substance, which thinks but has no physical extension, and physical substance, which occupies space but does not think. The mind and body interact, he believed, but they are fundamentally distinct. This position raised profound questions that psychologists and philosophers continue to grapple with today. If mind and body are truly separate, how do they influence each other? How does a non-physical mind cause physical actions in the body? And how do physical events in the body give rise to mental experiences? Descartes famously suggested that the mind and body interact through the pineal gland in the brain, but this proposal satisfied few people, and the mind-body problem he articulated has remained one of the central puzzles in understanding consciousness and mental life. Not everyone accepted Descartes' dualism, however. Thomas Hobbes, the English philosopher, argued that thought processes could be understood as mechanical motions in the brain. Hobbes was a thoroughgoing materialist who believed that everything, including human thought and emotion, could ultimately be explained in terms of matter in motion. He saw no need to posit a separate mental substance. Rather, thinking was simply a particular kind of physical process occurring in the brain and nervous system. This mechanistic view of mind was radical and controversial in its time, seeming to reduce human beings to mere machines and leaving little room for free will or moral responsibility. But it pointed toward a scientific approach to psychology that would eventually become dominant, one that sought to explain mental phenomena in terms of physical causes. The Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza offered yet another perspective. Baruch Spinoza argued that mind and body are aspects of the same substance. rather than seeing mind and body as two separate things, as Descartes did, or reducing everything to matter, as Hobbes did. Spinoza proposed that mental and physical are simply two different attributes or ways of viewing a single underlying reality. God or nature, as Spinoza called this ultimate substance, can be understood either in mental terms or physical terms, but these are just two perspectives on the same thing. This neutral monism, as it's sometimes called, suggested a way out of the mind-body problem by denying that there are really two separate things that need to be connected in the first place. Meanwhile, in Britain, a group of philosophers were developing an approach to understanding mind that emphasized the role of experience. British empiricists like John Locke and David Hume argued that knowledge comes from experience and association. Locke famously proposed that the mind at birth is like a blank slate, a tabula rasa, upon which experience writes. All our ideas, he claimed, ultimately derive from sensory experience, from what we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell. There are no innate ideas, no knowledge built into the mind from birth. David Hume extended this empiricism even further, arguing that what we call causation is really just the habitual association of ideas that have repeatedly occurred together in our experience. These empiricist ideas would prove enormously influential in psychology, particularly in the development of learning theories that emphasize how behavior is shaped by experience and association. Not everyone agreed with the empiricists, however. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant proposed that the mind actively organizes experience using innate categories. Kant argued that while all knowledge begins with experience, not all knowledge arises from experience. The mind brings certain structures or categories to experience, organizing the raw data of sensation into the coherent world we perceive. Concepts like causality, substance, and unity are not simply derived from experience, as Hume had argued, but are imposed by the mind as it processes sensory information. This view suggested that studying the mind's organizing principles would be crucial to understanding how we perceive and think about the world, and it influenced later psychological approaches that emphasized cognitive structures and information processing. In 18th century France, a group of radical thinkers pushed materialist ideas even further. The 18th century French materialists argued that humans are thinking machines. Philosophers like Julien Offray de la Mettrie wrote works with provocative titles like Man a Machine, arguing that all human behavior and thought could ultimately be explained in mechanical terms, without any need for souls or spirits. These ideas were shocking and controversial, seeming to many people to undermine religion, morality, and human dignity. But they represented a growing confidence that the methods of natural science could be extended to the study of human nature, and they anticipated the behaviorist and neuroscientific approaches that would emerge later. An unusual figure emerged in the late 18th century whose ideas would have unexpected influence. Franz Mesmer's theories of animal magnetism inspired later interest in hypnosis. Mesmer believed that illness was caused by imbalances in a subtle magnetic fluid that permeated all living beings, and that health could be restored by a practitioner who could manipulate this fluid. He held dramatic healing sessions in which patients would sit around a device called a baquette while Mesmer, dressed in flowing robes, touched them or passed his hands over their bodies. Many patients reported remarkable improvements, though skeptics suspected the effects were psychological rather than magnetic. While Mesmer's theory of animal magnetism was eventually discredited, the phenomena he observed were real, and they would later be understood in terms of suggestion and hypnosis, opening up important avenues of psychological investigation. Building on this interest in altered states of consciousness, Jean-Martin Charcot used hypnosis to study hysteria, influencing Freud. Charcot was a distinguished French neurologist who became fascinated by patients, mostly women, who exhibited dramatic symptoms like paralysis, seizures, or loss of sensation that had no apparent physical cause. Working at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, Charcot conducted demonstrations in which he would hypnotize hysterical patients and show that their symptoms could be produced or removed through suggestion. A young Sigmund Freud traveled to Paris to study with Charcot and was deeply impressed by these demonstrations. They suggested to Freud that psychological factors, particularly unconscious ones, could produce real physical symptoms, an insight that would become central to his development of psychoanalysis. Finally, around the same time, a more humane approach to treating mental disturbance was beginning to emerge. Philippe Pinel advocated humane treatment of asylum patients. Working in Paris during the tumultuous period of the French Revolution, Pinel literally unchained the patients at the Bicester and Salpêtrière hospitals, arguing that people with mental disorders should be treated with kindness and respect rather than as prisoners or animals. He believed that moral treatment, as it was called, which involved gentle handling, meaningful activity, and conversation, was far more likely to lead to improvement than punishment or restraint. This reform movement spread gradually across Europe and America, slowly improving conditions in asylums and establishing the principle that mental disturbance was a form of illness deserving of compassionate medical care. These developments set the stage for the emergence of psychology as a formal scientific discipline in the late 19th century, when researchers would begin to study mental processes using experimental methods, transforming speculation into systematic investigation. The movement toward more humane treatment of people with mental disorders continued to gain momentum throughout the 19th century. Dorothea Dix campaigned for better conditions and mental health institutions, becoming one of the most influential advocates for reform in America. Dix was a schoolteacher who became aware of the terrible conditions in which people with mental illness were kept after visiting a local jail and finding mentally ill individuals confined in unheated cells. What she witnessed horrified her, and she began a tireless campaign that would span decades, traveling throughout the United States and Canada to document conditions in jails, poorhouses, and asylums. She presented her findings to state legislatures, arguing passionately that people with mental disorders deserved proper medical care in appropriate facilities. Through her efforts, more than 30 mental hospitals were established or expanded, representing a significant improvement over the neglect and abuse that had characterized earlier treatment. While these institutions would later face their own problems, Dix's work represented an important step toward recognizing mental illness as a medical rather than a moral or criminal matter. During this same period, scientists were making early attempts to understand how the brain produces mental life. In the 19th century, phrenology popularized the idea of localized brain functions despite being incorrect. Phrenology was developed by Franz Joseph Gall and Johann Spurzheim, who proposed that different mental faculties were located in specific regions of the brain, and that the size of these regions determined a person's abilities and character traits. Moreover, they claimed that the skull conformed to the shape of the brain beneath it, so that by feeling the bumps and contours of a person's head, one could assess their mental characteristics. Phrenologists created elaborate charts showing where faculties like combativeness, acquisitiveness, veneration, and amativeness were supposedly located. While phrenology was ultimately discredited as pseudoscience, it did contain one important insight: the idea that different parts of the brain might be responsible for different functions. This concept of localization would prove to be fundamentally correct, even though phrenology's specific claims were wrong. The scientific validation of brain localization came through careful clinical observation and pathological study. Paul Broca identified a brain area linked to speech production after studying patients who had lost the ability to speak following brain damage. In 1861, Broca examined a patient known as Tan, who could understand language perfectly well but could only produce the syllable tan when trying to speak. After the patient died, Broca performed an autopsy and found a lesion in a specific area of the left frontal lobe. He examined other patients with similar speech difficulties and found damage in the same region. This area, now called Broca's area, was the first clearly demonstrated example of a specific mental function being localized to a particular brain region. It was a landmark discovery that established brain localization on a scientific footing and opened the door to modern neuroscience. Shortly thereafter, another key language area was identified. Carl Wernicke identified a separate area for language comprehension, showing that language involved multiple specialized brain regions. Wernicke studied patients who could speak fluently but whose speech made no sense and who could not understand what others said to them. When he examined their brains after death, he found damage in a different region of the left hemisphere, further back than Broca's area, in the temporal lobe. This demonstrated that language was not controlled by a single brain region but involved a network of areas with different functions. The discoveries of Broca and Wernicke established a model of language processing that, in its basic outlines, remains valid today, and they showed how careful clinical observation combined with pathological study could reveal the brain's functional organization. Meanwhile, other researchers were taking a different approach to understanding mental life, one focused on measuring and quantifying psychological phenomena. 19th-century physiologists like Helmholtz and Fechner studied sensation and perception, bringing the experimental methods of physics and physiology to bear on psychological questions. Hermann von Helmholtz, one of the greatest scientists of the era, measured the speed of nerve impulses, showing that neural transmission was not instantaneous but took measurable time. This was a revolutionary finding, suggesting that mental processes unfolded in time and could be studied using the precise measurement techniques of the physical sciences. Helmholtz also developed an influential theory of color vision and studied auditory perception, making fundamental contributions to understanding how sensory systems work. Two German researchers took the quantification of mental life even further. Ernst Weber and Gustav Fechner developed psychophysics, quantifying sensation by establishing mathematical relationships between physical stimuli and psychological experience. Weber discovered that the smallest detectable difference between two stimuli is proportional to the size of the stimuli themselves. For example, if you're holding a small weight, you can detect the addition of a small amount, but if you're holding a large weight, you need to add a larger amount before you notice the difference. This Weber's law showed that perception followed regular, quantifiable principles. Fechner expanded on this work, coining the term psychophysics and developing methods for measuring the relationship between physical and psychological magnitudes. His book on psychophysics, published in 1860, is sometimes considered one of the founding documents of experimental psychology because it showed that mental phenomena could be measured with the precision and rigor characteristic of the physical sciences. The idea that mental life might be amenable to mathematical description was taking hold. Johann Friedrich Herbart suggested mental life could be described mathematically, proposing that ideas compete for consciousness according to mechanical principles. Herbart, a German philosopher and psychologist working in the early 19th century, believed that ideas have different strengths and that they interact in lawful ways, with stronger ideas inhibiting weaker ones. He attempted to develop mathematical equations describing these interactions, much as physics had equations describing the motion of physical objects. While his specific formulations didn't prove lasting, his general approach of treating mental phenomena as subject to quantitative laws influenced later developments in psychology. Another important methodological innovation came from a Dutch physiologist. François Donders developed reaction time methods to measure mental processes, showing that the duration of mental operations could be quantified. Donders reasoned that if you had people perform a simple task, like pressing a button when they saw a light, and then compared that to a more complex task, like pressing different buttons for different colored lights, the difference in reaction time would reflect the additional mental processing required. By carefully designing experiments with different levels of complexity, he could effectively subtract out the time for simpler processes and isolate the duration of specific mental operations like discrimination or choice. This subtractive method opened up the possibility of measuring the speed of thought itself, giving psychology a powerful tool for investigating mental processes that couldn't be directly observed. Memory, too, became subject to experimental investigation. Hermann Ebbinghaus pioneered experimental memory research and discovered the forgetting curve, showing how retention declines over time. Working alone in the 1880s, Ebbinghaus made himself the subject of exhaustive memory experiments. To study pure memory processes without the complication of meaningful material, he invented nonsense syllables, meaningless combinations of consonants and vowels like ZOF or KEB. He would memorize lists of these syllables and then test himself at various intervals to see how much he could recall. Through painstaking work, he discovered regularities in how memory fades. The forgetting curve he identified showed that memory drops off rapidly at first, then more gradually, following a consistent mathematical function. He also discovered the spacing effect, showing that distributed practice leads to better retention than massed practice. Ebbinghaus demonstrated that memory could be studied scientifically using controlled experiments and quantitative methods, even for something as seemingly subjective as remembering. All of these developments, the clinical discoveries about brain localization, the psychophysical measurements of sensation, the reaction time studies, the memory experiments, were converging toward a crucial historical moment. Psychology emerged as a distinct scientific discipline in the late 19th century, establishing its independence from philosophy and physiology. While psychological questions had been pondered for millennia and studied in various ways for centuries, it was in the late 1800s that psychology became a recognized field with its own identity, methods, institutions, and practitioners. This transformation was marked by several key events and figures. The most symbolically important moment is often identified with one person and one place. Wilhelm Wundt founded the first psychology laboratory in 1879 at the University of Leipzig in Germany, a date often taken as marking the birth of psychology as a science. Wundt established a dedicated space where psychological phenomena could be studied using systematic experimental methods. Students came from around the world to train with Wundt, and many of them returned to their home countries to establish their own laboratories. Wundt wrote prolifically, producing a massive body of work on perception, attention, emotion, and many other topics. He argued that psychology should be an experimental science studying immediate conscious experience, and he believed that both experimental and cultural historical approaches were necessary for a complete psychology. Wundt and his followers used introspection as a method, training observers to carefully report their conscious experiences under controlled conditions. The introspective method involved presenting trained observers with carefully controlled stimuli and asking them to report the contents of their consciousness in a systematic way. This was not casual self-reflection, but a disciplined technique that required extensive training. Observers were instructed to avoid what Wundt called the stimulus error of describing the external object rather than their subjective experience of it. For example, when shown an apple, an introspector should not say, "I see an apple," but rather describe the sensations of redness, roundness, and so forth that comprise the experience. While introspection would later be criticized and largely abandoned as a primary method, it represented a serious attempt to study consciousness systematically. One of Wundt's students brought this approach to America and developed it further. Edward Titchener's structuralism aimed to break consciousness into basic elements, much as chemistry analyzes matter into elements. Titchener, an Englishman who spent his career at Cornell University, was perhaps even more committed to introspection than Wundt himself. He believed that consciousness could be analyzed into elementary sensations, images, and feelings, and that these elements combined according to principles of association to produce our complex mental life. His goal was to identify all the basic elements of consciousness and the laws governing their combination. Structuralism, as his approach came to be called, represented a systematic attempt to map the contents of the mind using rigorous introspective methods, but it would soon face challenges from other approaches. Indeed, not all psychologists were convinced that introspection was adequate. The Wurzburg school challenged introspection by studying higher thinking and finding that some thought processes were not accessible to conscious report. Researchers at the University of Wurzburg, including Oswald Kulpe and Karl Buhler, asked people to solve problems or make judgments and then report their conscious experiences. They found that sometimes people arrived at correct answers without being able to report any conscious process that led to them. There seemed to be imageless thought, mental activity that occurred without conscious content that could be introspected. This challenged the assumption that introspection could give complete access to mental processes and suggested that consciousness might be just the tip of the iceberg, with much mental activity occurring outside awareness. Across the Atlantic, American psychology was developing its own character. William James published The Principles of Psychology in 1890, emphasizing the stream of consciousness and mental adaptation. James, teaching at Harvard, wrote a monumental 2-volume work that became perhaps the most influential psychology book ever written. Unlike the structuralists who tried to break consciousness into elements, James emphasized that consciousness is a continuous flow, a stream that cannot be chopped into separate pieces without distorting its nature. He wrote beautifully about attention, memory, emotion, habit, and the sense of self. James was less interested in analyzing the static structure of consciousness than in understanding how mental processes function to help organisms adapt to their environments. His book was filled with insights, examples, and thoughtful discussions that made psychological ideas accessible and compelling. This emphasis on function rather than structure became characteristic of American psychology. Functionalism focused on how mental processes aid adaptation, asking what consciousness is for rather than what it is made of. Functionalists were influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution and asked how mental abilities help organisms survive and reproduce. They were interested in individual differences, in practical applications, in how psychology could be useful. This pragmatic, forward-looking orientation suited the American context and led to psychology being applied to education, business, mental health, and other practical domains. A key moment in the development of functionalism came from a critique of existing ideas. John Dewey's reflex arc critique in 1896 supported functionalist ideas by arguing against treating perception, thought, and action as separate elements. Traditional accounts describe behavior in terms of a reflex arc. A stimulus produces a sensation, the sensation produces an idea, the idea produces a motor response. Dewey argued this was an artificial decomposition of what is really a continuous, coordinated act. When a child reaches for a candle flame, for example, the seeing, reaching, touching, and withdrawing are not separate elements connected in a chain but aspects of a unified behavior with a purpose. This emphasis on purposive, functional unity rather than artificial analysis into elements became central to functionalist thinking. Functionalism became particularly strong at certain institutions. The Chicago School helped apply psychology to education and society, emphasizing practical relevance and progressive ideals. At the University of Chicago, psychologists like John Dewey, James Roland Angell, and later, Harvey Carr developed a version of functionalism that was closely tied to educational reform and social improvement. They believed psychology should contribute to human welfare and that laboratory findings should inform real-world practice. This orientation helped establish the legitimacy of applied psychology and demonstrated that psychology could be both scientifically rigorous and socially useful. American psychology was also creating the institutional structures of a scientific discipline. G. Stanley Hall founded the first U.S. psychology laboratory at Johns Hopkins University in 1883 and later founded the American Psychological Association in 1892. Hall was an enormously energetic organizer and institution builder. He had studied with Wundt in Germany and brought experimental psychology to America. He established laboratories, founded journals, organized conferences, and trained numerous students who went on to establish psychology programs at other universities. The American Psychological Association, which Hall founded, provided a professional organization that brought together the growing community of psychologists, established standards for the field, and helped psychology gain recognition as a legitimate science. Communication among researchers was essential for the developing discipline. The first psychology journal was founded to publish experimental research, creating a forum for sharing findings and debating methods and theories. Academic journals had been essential for the development of other sciences, and psychology needed its own dedicated publication venues. Wundt had founded a journal for philosophical studies with psychological content in 1881, and other journals soon followed in various countries. These publications established psychology's intellectual independence, creating a space where psychological research could be presented and evaluated by fellow psychologists rather than being scattered across philosophy, physiology, and medical journals. The existence of specialized journals, laboratories, professional organizations, and university positions all signaled that psychology had arrived as a distinct scientific discipline with its own identity and trajectory. While some psychologists were exploring consciousness through introspection and others were studying mental processes in the laboratory, another researcher was taking psychology in a direction that would prove enormously influential. Francis Galton studied individual differences and introduced the nature versus nurture debate that would occupy psychology for generations. Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, was fascinated by human variation and excellence. He collected data on families, measuring everything from physical characteristics to mental abilities, trying to understand why some people excelled while others did not. He coined the phrase nature versus nurture to describe the question of whether heredity or environment was more important in shaping human abilities. Galton was convinced that heredity was paramount, and he developed statistical methods to study inheritance and variation. He invented the correlation coefficient and pioneered the use of questionnaires and rating scales. His work on individual differences opened up an entire area of psychology focused on measuring and understanding how people differ from one another, though his advocacy for eugenics, the idea of improving humanity through selective breeding, would later be recognized as deeply problematic and harmful. The interest in measuring individual differences led directly to one of psychology's most enduring and controversial enterprises. Mental testing advanced with James McKeen Cattell and Alfred Binet, who developed ways to assess intellectual abilities. Cattell, an American who had studied with Wundt, returned to the United States and became interested in measuring mental capacities. He coined the term mental test and developed batteries of simple measurements, reaction time, sensory discrimination, memory span, that he hoped would quantify intelligence. These tests proved disappointing, showing little relationship to academic performance. Alfred Binet, working in France, took a different approach. Commissioned by the French government to identify children who needed special educational assistance, Binet developed tests of more complex abilities like reasoning, comprehension, and judgment. His tests, first published in 1905 and revised in 1908 and 1911, assessed abilities that increased with age and that related to school performance. Binet emphasized that his tests measured current performance, not fixed capacity, and that intelligence could be improved through education. His work launched the intelligence testing movement, though it would often be used in ways he would not have approved. The practical utility of mental testing became dramatically apparent during a global crisis. The first large-scale intelligence tests were used during World War I to sort and assign military recruits. When the United States entered the war in 1917, the military faced the challenge of quickly evaluating enormous numbers of recruits to determine assignments. A committee of psychologists, led by Robert Yerkes, developed group-administered intelligence tests that could evaluate hundreds of men simultaneously. The Army Alpha test was for literate recruits, while the Army Beta test used non-verbal items for those who couldn't read English. Nearly 2 million men were tested, providing psychologists with an unprecedented database and demonstrating that psychological testing could serve practical purposes on a massive scale. The tests helped establish psychology's credibility and usefulness, though they also revealed troubling cultural biases and were misused to support claims about racial and ethnic differences. Psychology in this era was not exclusively a male domain, though women faced enormous barriers. Margaret Floy Washburn conducted important work on animal cognition and motor theory of consciousness. Washburn earned her PhD with Wundt student Edward Titchener in 1894, becoming the first woman to receive a doctorate in psychology. Her book The Animal Mind, published in 1908, comprehensively reviewed research on animal behavior and mental abilities. She developed a motor theory suggesting that all consciousness involves incipient motor activity, that even when we're thinking or perceiving, our muscles are preparing to act. Washburn had a distinguished career despite the obstacles women faced, eventually becoming the second woman elected to the National Academy of Sciences. Another pioneering woman psychologist achieved recognition despite being denied a degree. Mary White Calkins became the first female APA president in 1905, though Harvard had refused to grant her the PhD she had earned. Calkins had completed all doctoral requirements, including defending her dissertation so brilliantly that William James declared it the best exam he'd seen at Harvard. But because she was a woman, Harvard refused to award the degree. Despite this injustice, Calkins established an important psychology laboratory at Wellesley College and made significant contributions to memory research and to self-psychology. She developed the paired associate learning technique and argued that psychology should center on the study of the self. Her election as APA president recognized her scholarly contributions and helped open doors for other women in psychology. Psychology was also beginning to move beyond the laboratory into practical application. Leitner Whitmer founded the first psychological clinic at the University of Pennsylvania in 1896, creating what would become clinical psychology. Whitmer had studied with Wundt and was teaching experimental psychology when a schoolteacher asked him to evaluate a child who was struggling with spelling despite normal intelligence. Whitmer examined the boy, identified specific difficulties, and designed remedial exercises that helped. This case inspired Whitmer to establish a clinic where psychological principles could be applied to help children with learning and behavioral difficulties. He coined the term clinical psychology and founded a journal devoted to it. Whitmer's work demonstrated that psychology could be practically useful in assessing and treating individual problems, not just discovering general laws in the laboratory. Meanwhile, in Vienna, a neurologist was developing ideas that would transform psychology and ripple through 20th century culture. Sigmund Freud founded psychoanalysis, emphasizing the unconscious mind and childhood experiences in shaping personality and mental disturbance. Freud began his career studying neurology and working with patients suffering from hysteria and other nervous disorders. He experimented with hypnosis but became dissatisfied with its limitations. He developed the method of free association, asking patients to say whatever came to mind without censoring, believing this would reveal unconscious conflicts and desires. Freud proposed that much of mental life is unconscious, that we are driven by desires and impulses we don't consciously recognize. He emphasized the importance of childhood experiences, particularly related to sexuality and family relationships, in shaping adult personality. He described the mind as composed of ID, ego, and superego, primitive drives, rational planning, and internalized morality, in constant dynamic tension. His ideas about defense mechanisms, the interpretation of dreams, and the talking cure revolutionized how people thought about mental life and psychotherapy. Not all of Freud's followers remained faithful to his original vision. Carl Jung developed analytical psychology and the concept of archetypes, diverging from Freud's emphasis on sexuality. Jung had been one of Freud's most promising disciples, but the two men eventually broke over theoretical differences. Jung believed that Freud overemphasized sexual drives and neglected the spiritual dimensions of human life. Jung proposed that in addition to a personal unconscious containing repressed individual experiences, there exists a collective unconscious shared by all humanity. This collective unconscious contains archetypes, universal symbols and themes that appear across cultures in myths, dreams, and religious imagery. Jung explored concepts like the shadow, the anima and animus, and the self. He developed the idea of psychological types, distinguishing between extroversion and introversion and different ways of perceiving and judging. Jung's mystical and spiritual orientation appealed to many people, though it made his work seem less scientific to many academic psychologists. Another early psychoanalyst took the theory in a different direction. Alfred Adler emphasized social context and striving for superiority rather than Freud's focus on sexual drives. Adler had also been part of Freud's circle but broke away to develop his own individual psychology. Adler believed that humans are primarily motivated by a need to overcome feelings of inferiority and to achieve superiority or mastery. He introduced the concept of the inferiority complex and emphasized how birth order and family dynamics shape personality. Adler took a more optimistic view than Freud, believing that people are fundamentally social beings striving towards self-improvement and contribution to society. His ideas influenced later humanistic approaches and community psychology. Freud's theory of female psychology, which included controversial concepts like penis envy, provoked criticism. Karen Horney challenged Freud's views on female psychology, arguing that cultural and social factors, not anatomy, shape women's psychology. Horney, a German psychoanalyst who later emigrated to the United States, rejected Freud's notion that women's psychology is fundamentally defined by their lack of male anatomy. She argued that if women envied men, it was because of men's greater social power and privilege, not their anatomy. Horney emphasized the importance of cultural factors and interpersonal relationships in shaping personality. She proposed that neurosis arises from disturbed relationships in childhood and described various neurotic strategies people use to cope with basic anxiety. Her work anticipated later feminist critiques of psychoanalysis and helped make psychoanalytic thinking more culturally sensitive. Psychoanalytic thinking continued to evolve across generations. Erik Erikson expanded psychoanalysis across the lifespan, describing 8 stages of psychosocial development from infancy through old age. Erikson had studied with Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter, and brought psychoanalytic ideas to America. Unlike classical psychoanalysis, which focused intensively on early childhood, Erikson proposed that personality development continues throughout life. Each stage presents a psychosocial crisis that must be resolved. Trust versus mistrust in infancy, identity versus role confusion in adolescence, integrity versus despair in old age. How these crises are resolved shapes personality and adaptation. Erikson's work made psychoanalytic thinking more relevant to understanding development across the entire lifespan and emphasized the role of social and cultural factors in shaping identity. While psychoanalysis was developing through clinical observation, other psychologists were taking a more experimental approach to understanding learning and behavior. Ivan Pavlov discovered classical conditioning through his research on digestion in dogs. Pavlov, a Russian physiologist, was studying salivation as part of the digestive process when he noticed something curious. Dogs began salivating not just when food was placed in their mouths, but when they saw the food bowl or heard the footsteps of the person who fed them. Pavlov realized this was learned behavior and set up carefully controlled experiments. He would ring a bell, then present food. After several pairings, the dogs would salivate to the bell alone. This classical conditioning demonstrated that a neutral stimulus could come to elicit a response through repeated association with a stimulus that naturally produces that response. Pavlov's work showed that learning could be studied objectively and that it followed lawful principles. His research earned him a Nobel Prize and profoundly influenced psychology, particularly in America. An American psychologist was making similar discoveries through different methods. Edward Thorndike proposed the law of effect after studying how cats learned to escape from puzzle boxes. Thorndike would place a hungry cat in a box with a door that could be opened by pulling a lever or string. The cat would initially engage in various trial-and-error behaviors: clawing, biting, reaching. Eventually, by chance, it would trigger the mechanism and escape to reach food. Thorndike would then place the cat back in the box and time how long escape took. Over repeated trials, the cat escaped faster and faster, gradually eliminating ineffective behaviors and quickly performing the effective one. From this, Thorndike formulated the law of effect. Behaviors followed by satisfying consequences are strengthened, while those followed by annoying consequences are weakened. This principle of reinforcement would become central to learning theory. These discoveries about learning through association and consequence laid the groundwork for a revolutionary approach. John B. Watson launched behaviorism in 1913 with a manifesto arguing that psychology should focus exclusively on observable behavior. Watson was frustrated with introspection and consciousness studies, which he saw as subjective and unscientific. He proposed that psychology should abandon the study of consciousness entirely and focus only on what could be objectively observed and measured: behavior. Psychology should be the science of behavior, not of mind. Watson was influenced by Pavlov's work and believed that complex human behavior could be understood as chains of conditioned responses. He emphasized environmental influence, famously claiming he could take any infant and train them to become any type of specialist regardless of talents or ancestry, given control of the environment. This was an extreme position, but it reflected behaviorism's emphasis on learning over heredity. Watson's most famous and controversial demonstration involved conditioning emotion in an infant. The Little Albert experiment demonstrated conditioned fear, showing that emotions could be learned through association. Watson and his graduate student Rosalie Rayner worked with an infant called Little Albert. They first established that Albert was unafraid of a white rat. Then they began pairing the rat with a loud noise made by striking a steel bar. After several pairings, Albert became afraid of the rat alone, crying and trying to crawl away when it was presented. The fear generalized to similar objects like a rabbit, a dog, and a white fur coat. This experiment demonstrated that fears could be learned through classical conditioning, though it raised serious ethical questions that would never be acceptable today. Watson proposed that many human emotions and phobias might be acquired through similar conditioning processes. The behaviorist approach reached its most sophisticated form in the work of another psychologist. B.F. Skinner developed operant conditioning, showing how behavior is shaped by its consequences. Working several decades after Watson, Skinner distinguished between classical conditioning, where stimulus elicits a response, and operant conditioning, where behavior operates on the environment to produce consequences. He designed the famous Skinner box, a control chamber where animals could press levers or peck keys to receive food or avoid shock. Through painstaking observation, Skinner discovered principles of reinforcement and showed how different schedules of reinforcement produce different patterns of behavior. He demonstrated shaping, where complex behaviors can be built up by reinforcing successive approximations. Skinner believed that virtually all behavior could be understood in terms of reinforcement history, and that understanding these principles would allow for the prediction and control of behavior. His work had enormous influence on psychology, education, and behavioral therapy. Not all psychologists accepted the behaviorist restriction to studying only observable behavior. Gestalt psychologists argued perception is organized into wholes, not built up from elementary sensations. Gestalt psychology emerged in Germany in the early 20th century as a reaction against both structuralism's analysis of consciousness into elements and behaviorism's reduction of behavior to stimulus-response connections. Gestalt psychologists like Max Wertheimer, Kurt Koffka, and Wolfgang Kohler argued that perception is holistic, that we perceive organized patterns and meaningful wholes, not collections of sensory elements. The whole is different from the sum of its parts. When you see a melody, for example, you hear it as a unified pattern, not as a sequence of individual notes. The same melody played in different keys, using completely different notes, is still recognized as the same melody because the relationship between the notes is preserved. This emphasis on organization and structure contrasted sharply with behaviorism's focus on simple associations. The Gestalt psychologists identified specific principles governing perceptual organization. Gestalt principles like figure-ground organization shaped perception research for decades. They showed how we automatically organize visual fields into figures that stand out against backgrounds, how elements that are close together or similar are grouped, how we tend to perceive continuous forms rather than broken ones, how we perceive closure even when patterns are incomplete. These principles demonstrated that perception involves active organization according to built-in principles, not passive reception of sensory data. The Gestalt approach influenced many areas of psychology and challenged the dominant empiricist view that all mental structure comes from experience. One Gestalt psychologist applied these ideas to social psychology. Kurt Lewin developed field theory and group dynamics, applying Gestalt principles to understanding social behavior. Lewin argued that behavior is a function of the person and the environment, that to understand why someone acts as they do, you need to understand their life space, their psychological environment, how they perceive and understand their situation. He used topological maps to represent psychological fields and forces. Lewin was particularly interested in group processes and was a pioneer in studying leadership styles, group decision-making, and organizational change. He coined the phrase action research, emphasizing that research should address real social problems and that the best way to understand something is to try to change it. Lewin's work helped establish social psychology as an experimental science and had practical applications in industry, education, and community development. Social psychology was documenting powerful effects of social influence on individual behavior. Solomon Asch demonstrated conformity in his famous line judgment studies, showing how people would deny their own senses to align with a group's wrong answer. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments shocked the world, showing how far people would go in inflicting harm on another person under the direction of an authority figure. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford Prison experiment, though ethically controversial, demonstrated the powerful influence of situational roles on behavior. These studies showed that social factors could be far more powerful in shaping individual behavior than personality or moral character alone. Meanwhile, other researchers were taking a different approach that placed the human being at the center. Humanistic psychology emerged as a third force in psychology, rejecting the deterministic nature of both psychoanalysis and behaviorism. Psychologists like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers believed that humans are inherently good and are motivated by a drive towards self-actualization, the realization of one's full potential. Maslow proposed a hierarchy of needs, suggesting that basic needs must be met before people can pursue higher psychological growth. Rogers developed client-centered therapy, emphasizing unconditional positive regard, empathy, and congruence as essential for therapeutic change. Humanistic psychology shifted the focus from pathology and past trauma to growth, potential, and conscious experience, offering a more optimistic and person-centered perspective. The behaviorist dominance in American psychology began to face challenges in the mid-20th century. Critics argued that behaviorism's exclusive focus on observable behavior ignored crucial internal mental processes. George Miller studied the capacity of short-term memory, finding that people could hold about 7 pieces of information, the magical number 7, plus or minus 2. This research demonstrated that internal cognitive limits could be measured and that mental processes were a legitimate object of scientific study. Noam Chomsky published a devastating critique of B.F. Skinner's book Verbal Behavior, arguing that language acquisition could not be explained purely through reinforcement and imitation. Chomsky proposed that the human brain contains an innate, universal grammar, a structure that allows children to learn language quickly and spontaneously. This critique helped turn the focus back to internal mental structures. These intellectual currents converged in the cognitive revolution. The cognitive revolution led to the emergence of cognitive psychology, viewing the mind as an information processing system, much like a computer. Researchers began to use the computer as a metaphor for the mind, thinking of mental processes as algorithms, inputs, outputs, and memory stores. This allowed them to study processes like attention, perception, memory, and decision-making using rigorous, experimental methods. Ulrich Neisser, with his 1967 book Cognitive Psychology, helped define and solidify the new field. Cognitive psychology transformed the scientific study of the mind and became the dominant paradigm in experimental psychology. The study of memory continued to advance with new models. Atkinson and Shiffrin proposed the multi-store model of memory, suggesting memory flows through sensory, short-term, and long-term stores. Endel Tulving developed the distinction between episodic and semantic memory, showing that memory for events is separate from memory for facts. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky pioneered research on human judgment and decision-making, showing that people rely on mental shortcuts or heuristics that can lead to systematic errors, challenging the view that human reasoning is always perfectly rational. This work bridged the gap between cognitive psychology and economics, leading to the field of behavioral economics. Developmental psychology documented the stages of childhood thinking. Jean Piaget developed a theory of cognitive development, describing how children's thinking progresses through distinct stages: sensoromotor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. Piaget showed that children do not just think less competently than adults but think in qualitatively different ways. His painstaking observations and clever experiments fundamentally changed how educators and parents understood childhood thought. The study of moral development also took a stage-based approach. Lawrence Kohlberg proposed a stage theory of moral development, suggesting moral reasoning progresses from avoiding punishment to internal ethical principles. Kohlberg argued that moral development is closely tied to cognitive development, with advanced moral reasoning requiring advanced abstract thought. He proposed 3 levels of moral thinking: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional, each with 2 stages. While criticized for cultural and gender bias, his theory prompted a vast amount of research and discussion. In Russia, another developmental theorist offered a different perspective. Lev Vygotsky emphasized the role of social interaction and culture in cognitive development. Vygotsky argued that children learn best when they interact with a more skilled peer or adult, a process he called scaffolding. He introduced the concept of the zone of proximal development, the gap between what a child can do alone and what they can achieve with guidance. His emphasis on culture and social interaction provided a powerful contrast to Piaget's focus on the child's independent construction of knowledge, and his ideas became enormously influential in education and cross-cultural psychology. The biological basis of psychology gained new tools. Roger Spey studied split-brain patients, revealing the specialized functions of the left and right hemispheres. Spey worked with patients who had undergone a commissurotomy, a surgical procedure to sever the corpus callosum, the main connection between the two hemispheres, as a treatment for severe epilepsy. His ingenious experiments showed that the left hemisphere is typically dominant for language and logical processing, while the right hemisphere is better at visual spatial tasks, face recognition, and emotional processing. His work demonstrated the distinct yet complementary roles of the two brain halves, a finding that earned him a Nobel Prize. The study of the brain's plasticity also advanced. Donald Hebb proposed that neurons that fire together wire together, summarizing the principle of neural plasticity. Hebb argued that repeated co-activation of two neurons leads to a permanent change in the synapse, making them more likely to fire together in the future. This Hebb's rule provided a mechanism for how learning and memory are physically encoded in the brain. Hebb's work was foundational to the later development of connectionist models of the brain and artificial intelligence. Technology eventually allowed researchers to study the living brain directly. Brain imaging techniques like functional MRI transformed research by allowing scientists to observe brain activity in living humans. Earlier techniques like electroencephalography measured electrical activity, and PET scans could show metabolic activity, but fMRI, developed in the early 1990s, offered better spatial resolution without requiring radioactive tracers. fMRI measures blood flow changes that reflect neural activity, allowing researchers to see which brain regions become active during different tasks. This revolutionized cognitive neuroscience, allowing researchers to observe brain activity while people perceive, remember, make decisions, experience emotions, and engage in social interaction. The technique has limitations. It measures blood flow rather than neural activity directly, and interpretation requires careful statistical analysis, but it has enormously expanded our ability to understand brain function. Clinical psychology also needed standardization. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, standardized diagnosis of mental disorders, providing common language and criteria. First published by the American Psychiatric Association in 1952 and revised several times since, the DSM describes mental disorders and specifies diagnostic criteria. It helped ensure that clinicians and researchers were talking about the same conditions, facilitated communication, and allowed for systematic research on prevalence, causes, and treatment. The DSM has been controversial, with debates about which conditions should be included, whether categorical or dimensional approaches are better, and the risk of pathologizing normal variation. But it has been enormously influential in shaping both clinical practice and research on psychopathology. Treatment approaches continued to evolve and combine. Cognitive behavioral therapy combined cognitive and behavioral approaches, addressing both thoughts and behaviors in treatment. Aaron Beck, working with depression, noticed that depressed patients had characteristic patterns of negative thinking. He developed cognitive therapy, which focused on identifying and changing distorted thought patterns, the cognitive triad of negative views about the self, the world, and the future. Separately, behavior therapists were using conditioning principles to treat problems like phobias and anxiety. Over time, these two approaches merged into cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which is now one of the most widely used and empirically supported forms of psychotherapy. CBT's emphasis on measurable outcomes and structured treatment made it a core component of evidence-based practice. Clinical research began to focus on validating treatment approaches. Hans Eysenck challenged the effectiveness of psychotherapy, spurring research on the efficacy of different treatments. In 1952, Eysenck published a controversial review claiming that psychotherapy was no more effective than receiving no treatment at all. This highly criticized but influential challenge spurred researchers to develop rigorous methods for evaluating therapeutic outcomes. The resulting research demonstrated that therapy is effective, but also that different therapies are effective for different conditions, leading to the rise of empirically supported treatments. Critical perspectives began challenging psychology's assumptions and biases. Feminist psychology critiqued gender bias in psychological theory and research, examining how women had been misrepresented or overlooked. Feminist psychologists pointed out that much psychological research had been conducted on male subjects and had taken male experience as the norm. They challenged theories that pathologized women or explained gender differences in ways that reinforced stereotypes. They studied topics that had been neglected, like women's experiences of pregnancy, motherhood and menopause, domestic violence, and sexual harassment. They critiqued the power dynamics inherent in traditional psychotherapy and developed more egalitarian approaches. Feminist psychology helped make psychology more inclusive and challenged the field to examine its own assumptions about gender, power, and what counts as normal or healthy. Questions about culture became increasingly important. Cultural psychology challenged the assumption that psychological findings from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies could be universally applied. Cultural psychologists argued that the mind and behavior are shaped by cultural context, and that psychological theories developed in one culture may not apply to others. They studied topics like self-concept, emotion, and morality across different cultures, showing the vast diversity of human experience. This led to a greater appreciation for the role of culture in shaping mental life and spurred the development of more culturally sensitive research methods and clinical practices. Another approach drew on biology to understand behavior. Evolutionary psychology applied principles of natural selection to understand behavior and mental processes. Evolutionary psychologists argue that many psychological mechanisms are adaptations, shaped by natural selection to solve problems faced by our ancestors. They study topics like mate selection, parenting, cooperation, aggression, and fear, asking what adaptive problems these behaviors might have solved in ancestral environments. For instance, our tendency to fear snakes and spiders more readily than cars or guns might reflect ancestral dangers. Disgust might have evolved to help us avoid disease. Parent-offspring conflict might reflect different genetic interests. Evolutionary psychology has generated interesting hypotheses, though it has been criticized for sometimes offering just-so stories that are difficult to test and for potentially justifying existing inequalities as natural. At its best, evolutionary psychology offers a framework for asking why certain psychological mechanisms exist and generates testable predictions about behavior. The science of measuring psychological characteristics continued to advance. Psychometrics became increasingly sophisticated in developing and validating tests while addressing concerns about bias. Psychometricians developed item response theory, which models the relationship between test takers' abilities and their probability of answering items correctly. They developed methods for detecting differential item functioning, where test items work differently for different groups, potentially indicating bias. They grappled with questions about what tests actually measure, how to ensure tests are fair, and how to interpret scores appropriately. The field has become more aware that tests are not pure measures of ability but are influenced by motivation, test-taking skills, cultural background, and situational factors. Modern psychometrics tries to account for these complexities while maintaining the rigor that makes testing useful. Methods for synthesizing research findings also improved. Meta-analysis emerged as a powerful tool for combining results across multiple studies, providing more reliable conclusions than individual studies. Rather than simply reviewing studies and trying to make sense of conflicting findings, meta-analysis uses statistical methods to pool data from multiple studies on the same question, providing a more precise estimate of the true effect. This technique has been crucial in fields like clinical psychology, allowing researchers to establish which therapeutic interventions are most effective. Technology also brought new ethical challenges. The ethics of psychological research became a major focus, leading to the development of institutional review boards to protect human and animal subjects. High-profile experiments like Milgram's obedience study and Zimbardo's prison experiment highlighted the risks of psychological research. The American Psychological Association and government agencies developed strict ethical guidelines governing informed consent, deception, protection from harm, and confidentiality. The creation of institutional review boards, IRBs, ensures that all research involving human participants is reviewed and approved by an independent committee. These developments made the conduct of psychological science more responsible and humane. Positive psychology shifted focus toward human strengths. Martin Seligman championed positive psychology, focusing on human flourishing, happiness, and strengths rather than only on dysfunction and illness. For decades, psychology had largely focused on repairing what was wrong, treating mental illness and studying pathology. Positive psychology, championed by Seligman in the late 1990s, argued that psychology should also study what makes life worth living: happiness, well-being, gratitude, optimism, and resilience. This approach has generated a massive body of research and new interventions aimed at enhancing human flourishing. The accumulated knowledge from psychological research increasingly shapes practice and policy. Evidence-based practice has become the standard across therapeutic, educational, and policy domains, with decisions guided by research findings rather than intuition or tradition alone. In clinical psychology, evidence-based practice means using treatments that have been empirically demonstrated to work for particular conditions. In education, it means using teaching methods that research has shown to be effective. In public policy, psychological research informs interventions to promote health behaviors, reduce prejudice, improve decision-making, and address social problems. This doesn't mean that research provides simple answers or that clinical judgment and contextual factors don't matter, but it does mean that psychological science can and should inform how we try to help people and improve society. The translation from research to practice remains imperfect, with ongoing challenges in disseminating findings, adapting interventions for diverse settings, and ensuring that what works in controlled studies also works in the messy complexity of real life. As we think about where psychology has come from, tracing its roots from ancient speculation about the mind through the establishment of laboratories and competing schools of thought to today's sophisticated research programs, we can see both continuity and change. The fundamental questions about how we perceive, think, feel, remember, and relate to one another, about what shapes personality and what causes psychological distress, about how people learn and develop and make decisions. These questions have remained central across centuries. But the methods for addressing them have become increasingly sophisticated, the knowledge base has grown enormously, and psychology has become more reflective about its own assumptions and limitations. Modern psychology recognizes that behavior emerges from complex interactions between biological, psychological, and social factors, that understanding requires multiple levels of analysis and multiple methods, and that psychology must attend to diversity, context, and culture rather than assuming its findings are universal. The journey from supernatural explanations of mental disturbance to modern neuroscience, from philosophical speculation to controlled experimentation, from asylum chains to evidence-based practice is a long one, but it is not over. The major themes, the role of the brain and body, the influence of nature versus nurture, between individual and society continue to be explored. New challenges emerge as technology transforms how people live, as societies become more diverse and interconnected, as we recognize the urgency of addressing climate change and social inequalities. Psychology will continue evolving, continuing the long human project of trying to understand ourselves, a project that connects ancient philosophers wondering about the soul to contemporary researchers scanning brains and analyzing behavior. This is the story of psychology, a story that is still being written, a story that ultimately is about nothing less than understanding what it means to be human. And as we've traced this long arc from ancient times to the present, we've seen how each generation has built upon the insights of those who came before, sometimes correcting their errors, sometimes validating their intuitions, always pushing toward deeper understanding. The history of psychology is the history of humanity's attempt to illuminate the workings of our own minds, and that quest, that journey towards self-understanding, continues into an uncertain but fascinating future. Psychology has come a long way from attributing mental disturbances to spirits and demons, yet the fundamental drive to understand human nature, to alleviate suffering, and to help people live better lives remains constant across the centuries, connecting us to all those throughout history who have pondered the mysteries of mind and behavior.